Good evening, everybody. Keith here. Hoping everybody's had a good day, enjoying life, living life, loving life. I hope everybody's going to have a good day, enjoying life, living life, loving life. We're right on the crux of that hour, so I wanted to cover both. So, as many know, I've been on this path here for about 6 years about this driver's license thing, the birth registration, social security card, bank accounts, addresses, education, hospitalizations, all of it. Reading, writing, arithmetic, literature, history, politics, religion, sciences, magic, you name it. I've done a lot of research, but I've also done a lot of first-hand research outdoors. That's my favorite, just so you know. But in the meantime, back to this research here. You'll find that all the research always pertains to names and numbers that identify a record. And that's it. Because that's the folly of an identification. We have to realize, people, if somebody seriously believes that we're required to have an identification, the reason for the identification is so that you can have access in and out of certain persons, places, and things as defined, described, and otherwise in documentation. That's it. And that documentation is the record that is kept in those places, such as hospitals, libraries, schools. And then, of course, you have other places like restaurants that don't have guest lists. You have hotels and stuff that you have to register in. So there we find two other different kinds of classifications of contract statuses, I would call them. Because again, that's all that identification is. It's an associative item stating that somewhere there is an agreement, and that agreement has come to a meeting of the minds. And while meeting of the minds, I want people to realize the scripture talks about giving Adam a wife help meet, and that's what the meeting of the minds is another body that can meet with the minds to help affect things. So that contract has to have that meeting of the minds, and that meeting of the minds is meant, and again we see this in contract terms and conditions, equal consideration, equal benefit, to help each other, not to be detrimental to each other. In that identification, that, like I said, that's an association. And when we believe that we are subject to that identification system, then we have to be able to prove that ourselves. So I'm going to show you the foolery, your own foolery, of believing that you're subject to any identification. So let's take a look at it. And this is going to be a short video because I'm going to point this out. And this is why I've been going the way I've been going. And that is because there are certain things in place that already exist that we can just use to affect things for our benefit. Not an advantage, but a benefit. I have to fix my cable here real quick. Okay. This is Homeland Security. Presidential Directive 12. And it says policy. Okay? So this is a presidential directive. So it's a policy for a common identification standard. Again, not a law, but merely a policy for a standard within those people that are involved in the policy, which would be for federal employees and contractors with tractors. For farming, implementing agriculture. And as I've explained before, we're not meant to be committing to agriculture. That's a stem of personage. We're meant to tender the land. And we do this by being shepherds of its creatures, ministering the word of the gospel to all creatures. The word of the gospel is the word of love. We're supposed to love those creatures and tend to them as their hooves make tender the earth, opening the earth so it can harbor and basket the weaves or the seeds that drop by the wayside as we travel along with that herd, attracting other wildlife to that pathway, birds, insects, other animals that also carry those minerals and seeds and nutrients and stuff. Our paths are supposed to intermingle because we're supposed to be sojourners. Homeland Security Presidential Directive for contractors with farming, people that settle down, that believe they have a right to settle the land. The land's already settled under Leviticus 25 verses 23 and 24. The land shall not be sold forever, for it is mine, and ye are strangers and sojourners with me. What better excuse to commit to the idea that we are strangers and sojourners, and we do not need a specific house. Okay, so let's go on with it. It says there are wide variations. There's a diversity. While they put us in his public education system, delineating those variations, saying they're limited. And as I spoke in a video earlier, they're not. Just like the 9th Amendment to the Constitution of the United States, which is the 9th article, Article 9 of the Bill of Rights, it explains that there are other things, they call them rights, but there are other things, tangible and intangible, in aspects of varying degrees that are already in existence. So it's not something that they need to set a policy for, it just already is. And it's supplemental to their policy. It exists without their policy. It's like equity. Equity exists without law. So that tells us nobody can really discuss equity because equity acts in personam. You can only do it in personam. This means one at a time. You can't depend on paperwork from someone else to be equity. You have to be able to act. Every breath is an act of God. In the quality and security of identification used, like I said earlier, to gain access to secure facilities, places, to do secure things, activities, by secure persons, indentured, licensed already to do so, under an oath of fealty to that commercial element, meaning you've given up the fealty of the Spirit. He is no respecter of persons. He respects the Spirit. And if you give up the spirituality for the manuality, the spiritual for the manual, then you've already lost, in my opinion. That's the way I interpret it. Where there is potential for terrorist attacks. Secure facilities where there is potential for terrorist attacks. In order to eliminate, remember, this is standard for federal employees and contractors. Federal employees and contractors. In order to eliminate these variations, see, that's their task. is to eliminate the variations. That's what the public education does. It delineates everybody down one path, saying you got to do this, you got to do that, and you got to do this, this, and that. And when somebody else says you got to do this, you got to do it. You got to. You got to. No, you don't. There's no law. This is identification used to gain access to secure facilities. That's why they need the surface identification. They need the surname with the surface. A picture ID with the surname on it. Or in it. U.S. policy is to enhance security. To enhance security. To have security means you've given up right for their providing security, their provision of security. That's like Davy taking on all the armor and weapons that the village wanted to give him so he could fight Goliath. He would have failed in that fight. He'd have never been able to lift up the armor. He'd have never been able to lift up the shield. He'd have never been able to lift up that huge sword. For the security that's offered, what is it worth? Increase government's efficiency, reduce identity fraud, and protect personal privacy by establishing a mandatory government-wide standard for secure and reliable forms of identification issued by the federal government to its employees and contractors, including contractor employees. Now, what you're doing by using a name and an address with a federal zip code through the Postal Service is you're claiming that you're an agent able to contract doing banking operations and transfers, and therefore you're required to carry insurance. That driver's license is an insurance. In order to be insured, again, under a federal policy for a common identification standard for federal employees and contractors, you now have to take on a tax liability and an insurance liability. That's what it's all about. This directive, a directive is a military directive, folks. It's not an order by administrative court or judicial judgment. See, those orders in the administrative courts, they call them summary judgments when they're done, but they've never had a judicial determination before the proper board in order to make a proper judicial judgment that can then be carried out and executed for a final judgment. See, the summary judgment has never been, it's been written down, but it's not definitive. The directive mandates a federal standard for secure and reliable forms of identification. So any form of state identification or licensing has a federal standard. Again, that's Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1. Congress shall lay and collect taxes and duties. You can read the full text. It's called HSPD 12, full text. And this comes from the definition of federal government means all entities of the government of the United States. United States is a corporation, and their government is a federal government, means all entities of the government of the United States. That's your federal government, okay? That's the democracy being provided by a federal government, and it is a provisional government. It is a military government, posing a democracy, operating as a communist. Means all entities of the government of the United States, and drawing all entities into the government of the United States by classifying them as entities through identifications. Without that identification, there is no entity. That is according to a manual, and like I said, you have a spirituality about you that should be posing the spiritual things of the government of the United States, including the United States Postal Service and the Postal Regulatory Commission. Okay? Source 5 CFR. Personnel. 5 CFR is personnel. So the personnel of the federal government are subject to the United States Postal Service and the Postal Regulatory Commission. They cannot make decisions without them. No entity can make a decision without the United States Postal Service and the Postal Regulatory Commission, and this comes from the personnel section under the Code of Federal Regulations. Not the U.S. Code, the Code of Federal Regulations. So we look at 39 CFR Chapter 3, Postal Regulatory Commission. In that, you'll find a lot of nice information. And I'm going to show you some other stuff here first. 32 CFR 156.1, mentioned in the Postal Regulatory Commission codes. Or possibly even this one here. I can't remember which one. It was posed in one of these. And I came about this one here, and it says National Defense. Remember, Postal Regulatory Commission and United States Postal Service, those postal services are operated through post offices. Those post offices, by an issue of the headquarters of the Marine Corps, are defined as inland marine installations staffed by United States Postal Service workers. Okay? And that's the national security. National Defense, National Department of Defense, under 5 U.S.C. 301 in their discussion of minimum birth registration and the Plain Writing Act, both in that very code. Office of the Secretary, Plain Writing Act. The Secretary is the one that keeps the minutes of the record. Okay? Of Defense. Department of Defense, that birth registration being operated through the Personnel Security Program, and that is a United States Postal Service and Postal Regulatory issue. Therefore, and again, this is all supported. I'll post this so everybody can see this, along with this link here. And when you go through and look at all these executive orders and everything, that's how we got to HSPD 12. Homeland Security Presidential Directive 12. And it talks about all of these other executive orders in 5 U.S.C. 301 and 7532, Section 1072 of Public Law 110, 181. These are all the laws you people need to become familiar with. And of course, that video I did earlier, what was it, Given versus Cuniff or whatever, 40 U.S.C. 11331, 10 U.S.C. 1564, that's a military code. You will see another military national security code right there, 50 U.S.C. 3341. You hear me speak about 10 U.S.C. quite a bit, and 50 U.S.C. 4305 specifically in regards to trading with the Enemy Act and full acquittance and discharge. And we use this 5 U.S.C. 301 as a full acquittance and discharge of the birth registration for its lack of plain writing. It does not qualify under the minimum birth registration because, like I said, it is a military issue under Department of Defense, which is operated by the Postal Regulatory Commission of the United States Postal Service as inland marine installations. I was not born into the Marines, the Navy, the Air Force, the Army, the Reserves. Before I formed thee in the belly, I knew thee. Before I formed thee in the belly, reliable forms of identification. Before I formed thee in the belly, I knew thee. Before thou was cast from the womb, I sanctified thee. I ordained thee a prophet unto the nations. This is what tells me in my heart that no one, through any ordinance, can sanction the word of God. Period. And that's what they've done. Literally, that's what they've done. So let's go back and show you 49 CFR 24.106. Expenses incidental to transfer of title to agency. The title is all those licenses, all those records like I spoke of earlier. The school record, the birth record, the medical record, the educational record, the any military records, any business records, employment records, banking records, loan records, all of it. You want all of those records collected up in a forensic audit and handed back to the Social Security Administration, Secretary of State, to comply with the minutes of the record. And that's comply with the minutes of the record, because the minutes of the record will show you again once I show you here that's a Postal Regulatory Commission issue as a matter of Department of Defense under a military issue. You were not born in the military, period. 42 U.S. Code, which is the Social Security Act. That's why we turn all these titles back to the Social Security. And these titles are under the 49 CFR's Interstate Identification Index. It's an identification in relation to interstate indexing. Indexing being an enumeration. The name and number identify the record. And that school record, that's a name and a number, and it's indexed in that record numbering system. The employment, that's a name and number, and it too is recorded in another record. So it's another identity. It's another person. So we take them all and we hand them all back to the state to secure them all in one place, who is the holder of all those records now and is now liable as a holder of those records and secured. They are secured. Now we're going to hand all the interest in the security of those instruments over to the United States. The beneficial interest back to the benefactor, the true Christ in Eucharist, flesh and blood, living soul, whose every breath is an act of God and has been misinterpreted and misidentified, misdescribed in these documentations here, both the state and the United States. and we're going to turn around and transfer them. Again, 39 CFR. That's the postal regulations. 19 CFR, the data elements under 19 CFR 149.3. Those are customs. And it was not customary for you to enter into the military. Okay? So we see in Postal Service regulations, we see, again, all these are, this is CFR, this is U.S. code. So they are regulated by the Transportation Code and the Postal Code here, and can't get around it. Underneath them, everybody got an identification for a license or a state identification to perform commercially. Up here is where that comes from. They get their judicial regulations here to administrate here. So we're going to just travel that title all the way back up the chain. This is your chain of title. This is where the title belongs. Not with you. You do not have a title. Do not keep one. If they have title in their records, the holder of the record, the keeper of the record is liable. They issued that title, give it back to them. Give unto Caesar what belongs to Caesar. Again, so we see again the exact same thing. Expenses incidental to transfer title to the Postal Service. So under 50 U.S.C. 4305, full acquittance and discharge, you give them a directive. And that's literally what it states under 50 U.S.C. 4305. You give a directive. Final foreign country money judgment recognition, establishing the living estate as opposed to the decedent estate. Merger in Chapter 15 bankruptcy. You'll find that if you search it under Title 11 of the U.S. Code. Private foundation is already recognized internationally. All you have to do is change up the communication. That title is now deposited. It's no longer a federal deposit. It's no longer under the Federal Deposit Insurance Act. It's under the actual assurance of a Postal One Master Trust account. All those credits from transferring the title, transferring all the security, settling all the accounts, and all the remainder credits that are brought back off of those records. The value that was instituted into the record has to be rectified, reconciled. That's what this is all about. It's a bankruptcy. You're going to reconcile the record under a merger of the old name with a new name. That new name is now going to be the old name converted for the new name in the master trust account. It will correlate with the holdings of these two prior accounts, now holding the federal government, known as the government of the United States, including the United States Postal Service and the Postal Regulatory Commission. And they are now liable to reconcile that record every 3 days if it is out of balance. That record ever goes out of balance with this Master Trust 1 account, they have an obligation to reconcile that account within 3 days. Research and resolve the account with the general ledger. This is what tells us this master trust account is attached to the general ledger. And that's done by establishing this as an open-end credit. Whatever credits are established by everybody's record, again, one at a time. You can't go by a set amount. You have to draw everything off the record. It's called a modernized drawback. You're going to draw everything back. Open-end credit deposit with the Postal Service, not the federal deposit. Again, you're going to remove that federal deposit. You're going to settle all those accounts. By and through a letter of credit established on that settlement of closing the federal deposit accounts. They're going to remain at zero from now on. They can never go out of balance. Now it's a new account, and if it goes out of balance, it's tied directly to the general ledger. And it must be reconciled, researched, and resolved within 3 days. And that establishes a fidelity agreement with the Postal Service, a requirement for them to be able to enforce the Treaty of Berne. Again, because post offices are in fact inland marine installations, enforcing both the Treaty of Berne and the Law of Nations as an extension of the ultimate naval treaty as marine installations, extensions from the Navy. Not the Army Land Forces. It's all backwards. And there's that 10 U.S.C. 8823 Admiralty claims by the United States. You're going in amicus curiae and showing them it's in their best interest, because all of these records here have proven a detriment not only to yourself but to them. So you secure them all at the Social Security, and then you put them back in the United States interest for them to fulfill the obligation of clearing the record with the Postal Service and the Postal Regulatory Commission that will come down on them if they don't. Because again, that's where they get their power. So anyway, I thank all one of you that watched this video here. Please share it. Again, I'll post it with my YouTube and stuff. But I'm sorry it went so long. I meant to make it shorter, but I thought it was important to explain that chain of title thing, because that's where we're at. So, have a great night. Remember, if it wasn't for you guys, I wouldn't be doing this. God bless. I love you. And rest well. We'll see you next time if I ever do another one. Thank you for joining us with Bedtime, Foolery, and Follies. El Hotep Second We Peril. Over and out.